Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to Late Night Learning. My name is Anthony Palomba and I am your host. Today we're going to keep going forward with communication theory. Now, in the last lecture, we kind of covered the historical trajectory of communication theory. We talked about ancient Greece. We talked a little bit about how rhetoric was developed by the sophists, how Plato and Aristotle came into play with understanding truth and knowledge and understanding empiricism, and how systematic observation of a phenomenon can really help create a body of scientific knowledge. We know that with the hundreds and hundreds of studies out there surrounding people watching TV and how TV impacts them and their ideas and their tastes and preferences, we have a systematic body of knowledge that evolves slowly, but nevertheless helps us understand cultural trends, sociological trends, and humanistic trends for that matter. Today we're going to be going over how truth and knowledge is kind of observed in an empirical sense. We're going to be looking at a few other angles of truth and knowledge as well today. So let's get started. So 21st century communication theory. These are not theories, these are methods, but I have this written here because I do think communication theory will be impacted by a few things that are coming out right now or have been heavily embraced by a lot of scholars. One is data mining, and that is not somebody going into a cave to mine. It is this notion that with the oceans and waves of data that we have out there, we can really learn a lot about people. And so people may become more and more predictable, which is the last thing anybody wants to hear. Nobody wants to think that they're predictable. Nobody wants to think that once they go out of their house, 8 o'clock on a Monday morning, some sort of advertising firm can predict where they're going to be or what advertisement they're going to want to listen to or where their next cup of coffee is going to come from. Nobody wants to be that predictable. We like to think that we're spontaneous. But we do have patterns, unfortunately. To an extent, people are predictable. It's never 100% because it's social science. And with social science, there's always a measure of error. There is always a level of unpredictableness, if you will, with studying humans. But our methods are getting better. And so people are becoming more and more predictable. The second thing that was on that slide is something known as Twitter scraping. So the idea is that with data mining, we know that there's data out there when we slide our credit cards or when we watch TV. If we're watching TV on our HBO Go app or NBC app, or if we're on Instagram, they're collecting data. If you are a 28-year-old African-American female in Brooklyn, they know that. They're trying to figure out if there are any patterns. Do women particularly do this on Instagram? Do women particularly do this with the Starbucks app? Where do African Americans like to go to watch movies on their mobile phones? If there are trends and patterns that develop, again, it's never 100%, but people are getting better and better at detecting these patterns. And from there, we have Twitter scraping. Now, Twitter scraping is this notion that we can literally scrape and pull tweets on Twitter. And so if we wanted to do a thematic analysis to better understand people's reactions to a new flavor of Gatorade, let's say it was blueberry cucumber, which is an awful tasting Gatorade, I think. If there was something that was blueberry cucumber Gatorade, and if I was doing advertisement or product development at Gatorade, I could pull maybe 1,000 tweets instantly and do a word search to get a better sense of what people's responses are to a campaign surrounding this flavor, or to their response about a commercial for blueberry cucumber, or whatever it may be. And so that is another innovation because you can kind of capture real-time response from consumers. It's not as though you release a product like Game of Thrones on HBO and okay, let's give it a few weeks and then we'll pull some people in for focus groups. You can measure this stuff instantly, and that's very, very exciting for a lot of scholars. We're able to pull a lot of live data now and really get a sense of how people respond, interact with each other through social media, all the way through texting and phone calls and watching TV. And so the world is becoming more measured, again, which is kind of a frightening prospect for some of us, but it also helps illuminate a lot of findings and better understanding of human consumption activity. Let's go back to that slide. So real data versus projected data. This has been an issue for as long as social science has existed. This notion of what's real and what isn't is still something that a lot of scholars and companies grapple with. To be able to put out a focus group is wonderful because you're able to kind of understand how people feel about a particular show. You get 5 or 7 people around a table. You have a moderator who might ask people questions about their favorite cookies or candies or what they think of this food or what they think of this product. It's a really nice way to better understand people's opinions. The same thing goes for surveys. Surveys help capture people's opinions, people's notions, people's ideas about things. But can people really remember what they do? How many times do you wash your hands in a week? Do you remember? The problem is that humans are incredibly incapable of remembering a lot of details about their lives, or not really being able to estimate them in a proper sense. And so, while surveys and focus groups do capture really good data, it's not necessarily real data. Sure, I might prefer HBO over Netflix, but if I wind up watching Netflix more in a week, then that data is kind of misleading. This is why apps are so exciting. Apps allow companies to collect data on consumers. Yeah, I can say that I watch Netflix 5 to 7 times a week. Let's say I'm on Netflix 5 to 7 times a week. But the Netflix app captures how long I watch something, when I do it, on what day, in what month, my age, my gender, my location. All of this information is compiled together, and it's real. And so while the methods that we use in the social sciences are rigorous and are incredibly strong, it's not always easy to pull real data. And so while scholars may run regressions and statistical analyses and modeling, which are all done in industry, by the way, these are real methods, it is increasingly difficult to be able to pull real data if you don't have an app or if you don't have something else. And some scholars have made innovations in creating apps to have students download onto tablets just so that they can start collecting real data about audience consumption habits, for that matter. And so I think that moving forward, there is going to be some sort of movement among scholars to try to get their hands on real data. For those of us whose area of discipline is based around it, if you will. So for me, being a media management scholar, being an entertainment scholar, I have to find different ways to get real data on what people are actually doing when they watch TV, or how long people are actually watching a Netflix or a Hulu or an HBO Go or anything of that sort. And so from all of these things, I do think in the future where we pull data is going to become more powerful. Surveys are great, but a conversation I recently had with a television professional at a major TV network had stated that he believed that surveys would probably dwindle in the future, the survey method. And so I hope you can kind of see why this is a really exciting time to start studying this stuff. There's a lot that's going on right now in mass communication surrounding collecting audience data. Let's go to the next slide. So the conceptualization of communication theory is really important to understand. How do we test theory? Why do we test theory? What goes into testing a theory is really crucial. Let's go to the next slide. So first, we have to understand what a theory is. How do we understand and evaluate phenomena? So facts are probably the first thing we stick with. A fact is an objective truth. As we can see from this sunset, we can see that there is orange and blue in the sky. That's an objective fact. You really can't fight that. It's something that is based in reality and is objectively true. There's no variation here. There are blue and orange hues in the sky, Another fact, there are mountains, or at the very least hills, in this picture. A hypothesis is a statement that attempts to measure some sort of relationship. And so, for instance, one hypothesis might state that when there is sunlight, plants will grow. Now, that hypothesis may come from observations and people saying, well, I keep seeing this happen, and so I think sunlight might be instrumental for plants to grow. And so from there, we might test a few hypotheses surrounding it. Plants don't grow when there's no sunlight. Plants in more sunlight grow more than plants in less sunlight. So these statements are hypotheses surrounding some sort of process we're trying to understand. Once we have systematic support for this data, we've run several studies with corn, tomatoes, trees, grass, and across all of these different kinds of plants and vegetables, we're finding that sunlight is paramount to their growth. Now we have a theory. We can call it the sunlight theory, if you will. The theory states that sunlight is instrumental for plants to grow. And so if we don't see plants growing in the future, we can apply this theory and see if it's true. This is a rather rudimentary, elementary kind of example, but nevertheless, this is pretty much how theories are created. It's very difficult to create a theory. It's very difficult to find consistent support for a theory as well. Some theories are supported more than others. So there's a lot of variation across a lot of different theories. Finally, there are laws. And as I said in the last lecture, this notion of gravity is a law. Gravity says what will happen. A law says what will happen. If I drop a pencil, it will fall. That is the law of gravity. It is telling you what will happen. It is not telling you how it will happen or why it will happen. The how and why are proven and tested through theory. Theory tells us why something happens or how something happens. It does not tell us whether or not something happens. Whether or not something happens is demonstrated through law. Let's move on to the next slide. So an example here, as I alluded to earlier, sunlight and plants. So a fact is plants grow in sunlight, for the most part. There are some plants that don't need sunlight, but for the sake of this slide, just roll with me on this. So a research question could be, why do plants grow in sunlight? That's a research question. Please be mindful that if you have a scientific inquiry and it is a question, it is not a hypothesis. It is a research question. It is an exploration into something that does not have much data to support it or many previous studies to support it. So some hypotheses: plants will grow when there's a lot of sunlight. Sunlight can help plants become healthier and stronger. Plants compete for sunlight in order to survive. If all of these are proven time and time again through studies with palm trees, pineapples, etc., then you have a theory. Sunlight is necessary for plant growth, etc., etc. And then the law is all plant life requires sunlight to survive. Again, I know that there are exceptions to that, but the law states what is going to happen. It does not tell you how or why. Again, the how or why is covered by theory. Let's move along. So that's nice, but why do I need theory? Some of you may still be wondering about this and saying to yourself, great, Dr. P, but really don't need it. Well, theory is an organized set of statements, and it can definitely be applied to more than just sunlight and plants. For instance, social identity theory is a very popular theory in understanding how consumers have senses of themselves in relation to conceptual group membership. So for one thing, one kind of group membership may be racial or based on ethnicity. And so African American audiences have been increasing in their attendance in movie theaters in 2016 and 2017. Why did this happen? Well, you could apply social identity theory and say, well, this group has a sense of group membership with other African Americans, and so movies like Moonlight, Fences, Hidden Figures, and Get Out that came in the movie theaters appealed to this particular group. They saw actors that they could relate to. So You might be scratching your head and saying to yourself, well, theory is pretty simple then. The theories that you've shared with us in this lecture and in the last lecture, pretty straightforward. That's the point. Theories are supposed to be simplistic in nature. They're meant to explain a phenomenon. The variables, operationalization, and other elements of a study create more complexity. But a theory on its face should be fairly simple. The complexity comes with studies. And so you may study social identity theory and brand loyalty, or brand equity, the value somebody ascribes to a brand. And then you may look at that through the prism of how Caucasians, African Americans, and Asian Americans consume particular TV shows and services through social identity theory. Are there particular shows that certain races or ethnicities may gravitate toward? And how they may erect and build upon brand loyalty through these shows and their consumption of them. That's where complexity starts to play a role in these scholarly studies. Let's move along. So, what must a theory do to be a theory? Well, a few things need to happen here. A theory needs to be descriptive. And so, a theory needs to make observations about reality. It needs to be something that can be seen at the very least. We need to kind of be able to point to things in reality that we're talking about. Additionally, a theory may be normative. It should, or it could, make judgments about reality. This isn't necessarily necessary, but many people would argue a theory should be normative. A theory should absolutely be simple. It should be something that's a few sentences long or maybe a basic model. It should have explanatory power. You want there to be explanatory power because why else would I apply uses and gratifications to understand why people are playing video games if it couldn't explain why people are playing video games? And so you want to be sure that the theory you use can explain some sort of process. Additionally, there should be some falsifiability or risk. In fact, the uses and gratifications approach, I know that I've referred to it as a theory, is really an approach. It's an approach because it doesn't really meet this threshold, falsifiability and risk. Does the uses and gratifications approach take a risk here in trying to explain why people watch TV? It says that audiences are conscientious and make consumption decisions about what TV shows to watch because they have some sort of expectation or anticipated gratification. Isn't that pretty much the case with radio, newspaper, and a lot of other media? Yeah, pretty much. So then there's really not much risk here. You're always going to kind of find that uses and gratifications can be applied to any media study. All right, so then there really isn't much risk here. It's probably not a theory. It's a little bit lower than a theory. That's why you may see the uses and gratifications approach instead of the uses and gratifications theory in a lot of different studies. Theory helps us organize knowledge, so it should help us organize knowledge. That means that there should be a body of knowledge on uses and gratifications, and there are literally thousands of studies using uses and gratifications. And finally, and most importantly, I would argue, there should be heuristic provocativeness. And I know that's a lot of sophisticated jargon, but the idea is that a theory that is applied should encourage more studies and further analyses. It should be provocative. It should be something new and different. It should encourage more analyses in a particular area of research. Let's move along. So what's a variable? A variable helps measure certain elements within a theory. So it should measure a concept that varies, such as satisfaction with Nintendo, let's say, which may vary from person to person. Not everybody likes Nintendo. Not everybody likes HBO. Not everybody likes CBS or NBC or Fox. For instance, we may use social identity theory from our previous example to explain why African Americans are attending movie theaters in droves. There's been an uptick in this particular audience segment. Conceptually, we should measure for viewing brand loyalty toward movie and relationships with actors in films. These are a few things we can measure that are based on social identity theory. Operationalized variables as well is something that needs to be considered. So we may define variables here. Are we defining and measuring brand loyalty as consumers' disinclination to switch from brand to brand? Or are we measuring brand loyalty as the amount of times they make a purchase for a product or service of a brand? I'll go through that a little bit slowly. With operationalizing variables, not just enough to say, we're going to measure for brand loyalty here. Okay, so some people may really like a brand. Fine. But that's not enough. What are the statements we're going to use here? How are we defining this variable? That's where operationalization comes into play. Brand loyalty here could be defined as consumers' disinclination to switch from brand to brand. I really only stick with one brand. I really like this brand. Or do we measure it as the amount of times they just simply make a purchase of something? They may make a purchase of something because that may be the only brand that's available to them, or they trust that brand. It may not mean that they have loyalty toward the brand, though. So you start to see how refined a lot of these measurements become and how important it is for scholars to be thinking about this. So it's important to understand not only what theory we might apply in a certain instance, but also the variables that might be related to social identity theory. Here, social identity theory may be used to explain why African Americans are attending movie theaters. So again, we may measure for viewing, we may measure for brand loyalty toward movies, relationships with actors in films. These are measurements we can use to better understand how social identity theory may be applied to understanding why African Americans are coming to movies. Let's go to the next slide. Communication paradigms. Ontology is the study of existence and reality. Is reality concrete? Is reality just out there for social interaction? Epistemology is the study of knowledge. How do we really know what we know? If I understand that somebody has told me that there is a black swan in Asia, let's say, but all I've seen here in the United States are white swans, I may or may not believe them, right? Because based on my objective reality, I can only see what I can only see. And so if I'm doing studies on swans, I might write down all swans are white because that's based on systematic observation. But being a post-positivist, which we'll get into in a second, post-positivists will acknowledge that there are variations in observation around the world, and that it's not enough just to rely on what one person realizes as truth. Let's move along. So the post-positive paradigm, that's a lot of P's right there. The goal is to explain, predict, and control communication behavior. We're really looking for cause and effect. Our ontology is realist. We assume reality is out there for exploration, like I said before with the swans. Epistemology is objective. We believe knowledge is created through systematic observation. The researcher role is knowledge discoverer. We're here to discover objective, value-neutral positions surrounding discoveries. So we rely on data. We do not really put our own opinions into our studies. Communication conveys information around the world. This is how we perceive communication. I myself identify as a post-positivist, personally. But there are other paradigms from which scholars come from when they are making and creating and publishing studies. Let's go to the next one. Another kind of paradigm that a scholar may come out of is the interpretive paradigm. The goal is to understand how relationships, organizations, and communities make sense of their worlds. Their ontology is social constructionist. The world that we live in is a world of our own making. So, epistemology, the creation of knowledge, knowledge is considered to be subjective. A lot of these scholars believe that it is subjective, which is a major departure from post-positivists like myself. The researcher role here is knowledge creator, once again, creating knowledge for society. And the communication role here is constitutive. Communication is the primary building block of our worlds. So an interpretivist is very much interested in looking at the world from really kind of an anthropological frame of mind, really kind of studying a tribe here or a group of people here or interaction between people here, and kind of seeing it as subjective in that, different things, different processes, different instances are happening around the world. So it may be difficult to study certain things in a very systematic manner, as emphasized by post-positivists. Let's go to the next slide. Critical paradigm. These scholars are interested in empowerment. That's their goal. Power relations influence our everyday experience in many ways. Power can inhibit our ability to experience our full humanity. So a lot of these scholars will look at big media companies like the New York Times, Warner Brothers, AT&T, and really be critical of these media conglomerates because they wield a lot of power. They wield a lot of influence. They control news. They control entertainment. They control a lot of things that you and I consume on a day-to-day basis. Their ontology is social constructionist, critical of socially constructed realities that crystallize into institutions. The epistemology, the creation of knowledge, they believe that scholars are critical in the critical paradigm question taken for granted notions about what counts as knowledge. So they constantly question what goes on in society, what is deemed factual, what is deemed alternative. The researcher role is as an advocate. Researchers work towards social change, and communication role power-laden, reinforce, transform, or resist ongoing systems of power. So they're very, very critical of media conglomerates. Let's move along. So as a theory wrap-up here, knowledge elaboration. We need theory because it helps us elaborate on knowledge. Theories aid us in organizing, anticipating, summarizing, and extending our own knowledge. Research stimulation. It encourages people to study the ways to change and improve communication. A lot of people have called for regulation of media, especially during the 1990s and currently when there's been a lot of deregulation, a lot of media buying up each other. Is this a good thing? As of this recording, Comcast has stepped into the Disney-Fox deal, throwing some $65 billion toward Fox to try to take Fox over and to prevent Disney from doing so. Either way, a lot of critical paradigm scholars would say, this is terrible. We are further propelling media conglomerization and certainly reinforcing and consolidating agenda-setting theory. Finally, theory is also important because not only does it help us elaborate on knowledge, help us stimulate research and encourage people to execute studies, but organization. We can look up thousands of studies that incorporate brand relationship theory, the uses and gratifications paradigm, the agenda setting theory, opinion leader theory. It goes on and on and on. And so theory, to me, is very, very powerful because when you're armed with theory and you know exactly what theory can do for you, it can really change the way that you go about your day. It can help you when you're in the office trying to understand how to reach people, whether you're an advertiser in public relations or maybe you work for a not-for-profit. But theories really do help us organize the way in which we think, approach studies, interpret studies, summarize studies, and also how we build future studies as well. They really are the building blocks for scientific knowledge. And it's incredible for you on this journey that you're taking to be exposed to this. And so that's all I have for you today. Thank you so much for joining me on Late Night Learning. As always, keep laughing and keep learning.